Hello and welcome. Greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Security 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. It is Friday, and so it is time for a week in review. If you're new here, basically every week, the offensive security team will go through and kind of comb through all the threat intelligence and different vulnerabilities, exploits, techniques, whatever's going on out in the cyber world that we think you might want to know about. And then we just break that down into meaningful chunks with the ultimate goal of being a little bit more prepared tomorrow, maybe than you are today. With that said, I'll introduce he doesn't have a name. Spencer is his name, and Brad here, talking about some neat subjects. First of all, you got the Lastpass Compromise. As a Lastpass user, that concerns me a little bit, and some cool a survey and some APT stuff going on. So take it away, Spencer.
Yeah, cool. We've got a lot of cool stuff going on this week. It always seems, I don't know if this is like you, or if this feels like this to you, but on Fridays, it always seems like big news breaks on like Thursday and Friday. So it's like we're scrambling at the end of the week, compiling all of the interesting things that are going on in the week. And then we kind of decide and boil it down to a few things on Friday. And it's like all these big things happen. Like the LastPass thing was just announced just recently, like 19 hours ago or something. And it's like, man, all these interesting things happen right at the end of the week, and IT people and us are all scrambling to wrap our heads around it and everything. So,
it's strategic, right? You know that. So, So we had to do some disclosures in previous lives and other places that I've worked, and we always did them on Friday afternoons, right? If there was a negative announcement, even if it wasn't cyber related, right? We would literally do a press release at 5:30 p.m. on Friday.
Yeah, I mean, why release it on Monday and have the entire week for everybody to nitpick it? Right?
Exactly. So anytime. And if it was good news, if it was new information, we'd have a press conference at 9 a.m. on Monday morning.
Yeah.
And so that is absolutely strategic. There's no doubt about it.
Yep, definitely. So so the first kind of interesting story is LastPass. So LastPass had a security breach. They said it happened about 2 weeks ago, and it targeted their development environment. And supposedly, according to LastPass, no customer data or encrypted passwords were accessed. And the CEO made an announcement and said there was unauthorized access to a portion of the LastPass development environment through a single compromised developer account. And they took actions, locked it down, did their thing. So kind of TLDR of this is, to keep an eye on this.
Right.
The sky is not falling on this. There's no evidence to suggest, or nothing I've seen to suggest that encrypted passwords or master passwords or any of the vault of users were compromised. But something to keep an eye on, right? Source code is commonly stolen to do nefarious things with. So something to keep an eye on, but an interesting development in the news, particularly because a lot of news media outlets and vendors are going to run with this and say, LastPass had a security breach, like everybody,
right?
Hair on fire. So we wanted to bring this up and talk about it and make sure everybody kind of has a level understanding of what this means.
Yeah, I agree. And there so many things come to mind just because there are lessons here that you and I are comfortable with, but maybe some other folks haven't been exposed to yet. And the first thing that comes to mind is what we call reputational risk. And, when we do penetration testing, in a lot of cases, individuals, the individuals involved who are, we call them sponsors, the people who want the pen test to be done and who review the report, we'll go say, for example, this happened literally this week. We found a vulnerable WordPress instance. Okay. And it was vulnerable to malicious file upload and operating system command injection. So we literally had the ability to take over the WordPress server. And so when we brought that to the customer's attention, they were like, yeah, but I mean, all it is an informational site. So it doesn't really do a lot for us. And so there's no sense of information. The hackers can't get anything. Why is this a critical finding? Mm-hmm. Well, it's a critical finding because NBC and CNN don't care that it was your WordPress site. What they care about is law firm ABC was hacked, period, end of statement. That is a massive reputational risk, right? That's when your clients flee the organization. People, when they Google your name, they get all these news results. And so it's, in this particular case, it was not a production environment. It was a development environment. And I'll get to that point in a minute. But reputational risk is a real thing. And what makes it even scarier is it's impossible to quantify. You will never know how much business you lost because people found that information looking for you and just chose not to even contact you to do business.
Yep.
So big deal. Right?
And it can be an opportunity too. When things like this happen, it can be an opportunity to have a good, transparent notification, right? I would consider this fairly good on Lastpass part, right? They happened 2 weeks ago. They made an announcement. It's a little bit weak on the details, right? We're kind of left wondering what this means long term. What particular source code was stolen, that kind of thing. But I would consider this a fairly transparent and a good notification by them. So in these situations, it can be to your benefit to get out in front of these and have a good communications to the public or to your clients or whoever it might be.
I agree. I agree 100%. And I didn't mean to imply that LastPass had done anything wrong in their notification, because you're right. They did do a good job, right? This is what you want, put the facts out there as quickly as you possibly can, in an incident like this. So yeah, no doubt about it. I agree. LastPass handled this well. And
go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, and they're a huge company, right? So there's going to be a lot of people talking about it, your mom, your dad, your grandma, all those things. So if you are one of those people who are in IT and do any kind of work, even if you're in more of a managerial role and your family knows you do IT, right? You're always like the printer help. You're the help desk guy of the family, So, you can kind of use this as some evidence to help them, reassure them, things are probably not as bad as others might make it seem.
Agreed. And, one other thing I'll mention too is, this was their development environment. Generally speaking, the development environments in most organizations have orders of magnitude less security than their production environments, right?
Yep.
And we run into this all the time in the pen testing world, in where there will be test or dev servers in an internal environment. And, you'll pop one really crappy account that is, in the test environment. And then suddenly that account accidentally somehow made it into production. And so there are tons of connections between dev and production. And I'm going to use dev to just broadly describe like test and prod or pre-prod and all that. But the point here is that your development / test environment should have all the same security measures that your production environment has, because we use that as a lateral movement opportunity every chance we get in penetration testing. And
I've seen actual production data in dev environments too. It's common, like organizations have their production systems, and sometimes it can be hard to generate, fake data and whatnot. So it's could also be common to see actual production customer PII, actual production data in those dev systems, just because it's easier to kind of do it that way. But so
I agree. But so I definitely wanted to mention that, like, if you're in the world of development and testing, secure those environments. They are important. There can be bleed over. Even if there's not bleed over, there are artifacts that will give us something. And we shouldn't have access to it. So, but it sounds like, to your point, this doesn't really directly impact anybody yet. So
far as we can tell, right? There might be news later on that source code is released to the public, and maybe, some researchers analyze it and look at it. But as of right now, according to what we know from LastPass, the sky is not falling just yet on this one.
Agreed.
But a good reminder to have MFA and properly secure your password managers, right? Those are the keys to the kingdom. And just a reminder, if you get that master password and you don't have MFA, that could be a real big problem for you. So
sure. So I guess if we were going to say, what do you need to do as a result of this? A is not much, but make sure that you, like you said, you have MFA on your for your master password.
Yep.
There's no doubt about
For sure.
it. Yeah. Cool.
All right. Cool. So the next interesting story this week is about APT 29 and Office 365 abuse. So APT 29 is a Russian espionage group that Mandiant's been tracking for a while, and others have been tracking for a while. They're likely sponsored by the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service. And there's some new kind of techniques that that Mandiant and others have been observing this group performing, specifically as it relates to Office 365. So just kind of a backstory, the reason Office 365 is such a juicy target is for espionage, for fraud, for business email compromise. It's a very big target, right? Business email compromise is in many ways one of the biggest components of cybercrime, or biggest contributors to cybercrime, right? BEC is just as large, if not larger, than ransomware. If you were to actually figure out what the cost of ransomware was, right?
Sure.
In total, BEC is up at the top. So one of the techniques that that Mandiant has observed is this APT would like to disable licenses. So in Office 365, you have different licenses for different components and security features and things like that. And that's controlled, or those security logs that are components of those things are components of what used to be called Advanced Audit. Now they call it Purview Audit, which, by the way, I don't really like that name. It's just so ambiguous. Like I preferred Advanced Audit. Like this just sounded better. But it's now called Purview Audit. It was previously known as Advanced Audit. And what they're doing is they're disabling licenses for specific users so that there's no audit trail anymore. Those logs are just gone. They don't exist anymore once you disable those licenses.
Solid.
Yeah.
And there's really nothing you can do that I'm aware of to prevent that from happening. You can only recover it if it does.
Yeah, as far as I know, Microsoft doesn't have any features that prevent disabling it. If you have the proper permissions to do it, you just disable it, right? You disable remove the license from that user.
And there's no alerting or anything like that either, right? So it's just just
yeah. So definitely something to review regularly is, and this is something that's very common in the BEC investigations that we do. We'll do an investigation with someone and we'll be like, all right, show us your audit logs, can you send them to us? And they'll be like, oh, shoot, audit logs are not enabled. And that used to be a problem. Now, Microsoft has since enforced audit logging on by default with new tenants.
Yeah.
So that's being less and less of a thing. But one way to kind of detect this or prevent against this is to just regularly review your licenses, check to make sure that everybody has a appropriate license assigned, and that you're actually getting those audit logs that you expect.
Agreed. Yeah. And maybe Microsoft will take a hint and at least create some type of alerting notification, something.
Yep.
So that if there are licensing changes, because, at the end of the day, like you mentioned, it is directly tied to the level of security features that you get. The licensing model, and monkeying with that basically can turn off a ton of stuff.
Yeah, and if you have an E5 license, or you have an E5 license on specific individuals, you get some additional advanced audit features, like it says here, mail items accessed. That will give you more details on what an individual did inside their mailbox. Yeah, what emails they were able to download or sync. All that stuff is in this mail items accessed and the additional auditing that's available through E5. So if you turn that off, it really hampers investigations and forensics after the fact.
Solid, yeah.
The other thing that's interesting, and it's not something that is necessarily just a Microsoft thing, is MFA takeovers of dormant accounts. Yep. So this article mentions, how this is done, but essentially, if you have a username and a password, and you have self-enrollment processes enabled, whether it's for Microsoft or for Okta or whatever it might be, if you have the username and password and that user hasn't set up MFA yet, you can just go in and register MFA if there's no other protections in place. So that's essentially what this is saying is this threat actor is password spraying or brute forcing or getting the password for accounts, and they're logging into them, and some of them have not been set up for MFA yet. So that can be a problem if you don't have things like conditional access in place and you don't have restrictions on trusted devices and things like that. So a good kind of method of process is when you set up a new user, make sure they enroll in MFA, as soon as they get their account, right? Don't let the MFA enrollment process lag on, because this could be, something that happens as a result.
Yeah. So we are super familiar with this issue because we leverage it on external pen tests all the time, right? Because we very, very frequently run into organizations. And like you said, it's not just O365, it's basically anything. And so we see this a lot of times in like larger organizations that have a larger user base, like higher education, hospitals, places like that, where they, and you'll ask them the question during your scoping call or your kickoff call and be like, you guys are MFA'd on all your stuff, right? And they're like, oh yeah, we have it enforced.
Yeah.
And then you do a password spray and 11 accounts have never been logged into through this external portal. And then you just configure MFA on all of them for them. And now you have the account and the MFA. Mm-hmm. To your point, conditional access is key. Here's the problem. If you have the lowest level of Microsoft O365, you don't have conditional access.
Yeah.
So basically, there is nothing you can do except, and I'm going to caveat this a little bit, make the enrollment only available from the inside of your network.
Yep.
Right? Like restrict it so that you have to be VPN'd in or on-prem in order to access the enrollment page. That was a little trick that we did in the financial industry before conditional access was even a thing. Mm-hmm. And so on our OA, we would have the enrollment process be mandatory from the inside of the network, from the trusted network. This is the only way we could figure out to get around that issue. Yep.
Definitely a good idea. If you don't have conditional access, there's ways to kind of put those controls in place. But it's definitely something to consider, and it speaks to kind of your internal onboarding process and user account review process and all things we kind of look at during assessments. So something to take note of.
And if you don't have conditional access, do whatever you got to do to get it. It is an absolute fundamental key defensive tool that if you do not have, you are exposed. Yep. There is absolutely more risk that you're taking on without having conditional access. So if that means you got to buy a bigger license, do it. If that means you got to get a different, some kind of other control, get it, because you need conditional access.
Yeah, and spoiler alert, the third thing I wanted to talk about in this article, the mitigation for it is, again, conditional access. And conditional access is great. We'll talk about it a lot, but it can help mitigate a lot of these headaches. And this particular one is these threat actors are now creating Azure virtual machines, and they are using those to log in to those compromised accounts. Yep. So what that means is those are Microsoft-owned IPs, right? They're in Azure, they're VMs in Azure, they're Microsoft-owned IPs, and they're less likely to be detected as a risky sign-in, it's called.
Yep.
And it's less likely to show up on the risky user reports that Microsoft has in Azure AD. So it is potentially less likely that you'll find those suspicious logins to those compromised accounts. And again, conditional access, where can users log in from which devices, which networks, et cetera, can all be really good mitigating factors here. So
I guess nobody got the memo about zero trust, because not only is this a common thing in Azure, Google is the same way. So we were actually just researching this recently. There is a similar issue where Google buckets have certain permissions to authenticated GCP accounts. right? Now, that doesn't mean I own the bucket or I have any explicit permission to that bucket, but an anonymous read has a different set of default permissions than an authenticated read, which means I can go create a free GCP account and suddenly I may have more permissions to your what do you call it? What's the Google bucket again? I can't remember. My brain is Friday.
I think it's a bucket, right?
Yeah. So I wasn't sure if there's a different word for it that they use, but they're equivalent to an S3 bucket. Yeah. And anyway, so weird stuff like that, right? Where you just go create a free tenant and suddenly you have way more permissions than you should.
Yep.
Interesting.
But Brad, I thought Zero Trust was a product.
Right.
I thought Zero Trust was just something I just buy and plug in.
Yeah.
And my problems are solved.
Easy, right?
Yeah. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't work that way, right? And we talk about this from time to time. It's like Zero Trust is a methodology, it's a framework, kind of a way of architecting security. And if somebody's selling you Zero Trust in a box, I'd be highly skeptical of that initially.
Of course. Yeah, there's no doubt about it.
So yeah, conditional access, really great, good stuff. The last and third and final item on our list here is the GitLab DevSecOps survey. Mm-hmm. And kind of, we were talking about this before we went live on the podcast, but before we get started, just level set here. Just everybody know that 63.4% of all statistics are made up. So keep that in the back of your mind when we're going through this survey and talking about these statistics that are clearly, I'm not going to say fabricated, but a lot of statistics are kind of, they're skewed, right? The sampling size isn't big enough, and there's a lot of problems with statistics and surveys. But I think this is a good indicator and something that you can probably speak to more, Brad, about kind of trends we're seeing with DevOps, with security when it comes to dynamic scanning and security teams working with developers. So some interesting statistics I think we thought were worth talking about.
Definitely. And so, DevSecOps is near and dear to my heart. Web application security is kind of where I lived for a very, very long time. And I used to actually hate the DevSecOps word. I still don't love it, but we might as well accept it because it's just part of the vernacular at this point. But
yeah.
But the idea here, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the topic, is basically integrating security into development, into the SDLC, right? Into the software development lifecycle. And the goal is to empower developers, right? That is kind of the slogan of DevSecOps. And it's a marriage of development, security, and operations is where the name comes from. So with that little bit out of the way, these statistics are almost wholly irrelevant. However, they're interesting. And the reason that I make that statement is because these percentages and increases and changes, none of that means anything to you. It has no impact on you. It doesn't change the security of your applications. But it's still interesting because we're seeing DevSecOps become a more and more accepted methodology for doing application security, right? Mm. And so we do that here at Secure IT 360. We do DevSecOps. We do curated application security, app pen testing, all that stuff. And so we're really integrated into this world. And these numbers, some of them are just purely like, whoa, dude, no way. It's impossible. But some of them are like, okay, that's good or interesting. So
yeah, like 53% and 55% respectively. So 53% of devs are doing SAST. And that was an increase from 40% last year. 55%, the survey says, are doing DAST, which is up 11% from last year. So more teams are apparently doing dynamic and static application security testing, which is good, right? That's a good thing. We can argue about the numbers all day long, but if we see a trend, we can say, it would appear that developers scanning their code is increasing, right? That's happening more often, which hopefully translates to fewer vulnerabilities. But there's still some key challenges that the survey points out as well that we'll talk about.
Yeah. And I'm immediately skeptical of 55 of more people doing DAST than SAST. That
Yep.
seems so backwards to me because, in the evolution or the maturity models associated with DevSecOps, you almost always start with SAST. And again, DAST means a lot of things to different people.
Yep.
It could be you just run a burp scanner with the default configuration, which is effectively useless.
Right.
Or it could mean that you're actually using a correctly configured DAST tool that is, integrated into your test dev environment, et cetera. So again, these things, you have to really drill down. The details matter when we're talking about this stuff, but still interesting.
Yeah. One of the other interesting statistics I thought we would talk about is it says 47% of security people said devs find 24% or less of available bugs.
Mhm.
And I mean, those numbers are just interesting. Like 47% of security people said 24% of devs.
What does that even mean?
It's like, I can't even wrap my head around that. But I think the point of what they're trying to say is there's a lot of bugs left for security people to find, meaning developers are finding an amount of bugs, right? But there's still a ton of other bugs that are left to be found. So there's some key challenges to that, like prioritizing those vulnerabilities, testing too late in the process, and finding people that actually fix those vulnerabilities. But I thought that was kind of an interesting finding from this as well.
It is. And like, I don't know about the whole 47%, 24%, 75%. I don't know where those numbers come from or how you could even quantify those numbers, because how do you know 75% of the bugs were left for security to find? And if you're doing DevSecOps, by the way, why is security involved? And at what point in the development process? I said that wrong. Security has to be involved. But what I mean is, at what point in the DevSecOps model is security finding 75% of the bugs?
Yeah.
Are we talking about pen testing? Are we talking about when they review the DAST reports? Like, there's so many questions I have.
Yeah.
However, I do want to point something out, that it is perfectly acceptable that the DevSecOps model does not find 100% of the bugs, right? DevSecOps, by its very nature, is automated testing, and you have to do manual testing on applications because, for example, we ran into this a couple of years ago with a financial application where if you just didn't put in the password, it would bypass a portion of the code and log you in with the user account that you supplied, right? And it was just an oversight in testing, but SAST isn't going to find that. SAST is looking for programmatical errors, right? Or bad coding practices. But if the application was designed to ignore the password field, it's not going to be found unless a human being tests it out. And that was obviously a severe flaw. And so, it's okay that security is going to find some of that stuff when they do penetration testing, right? Or whatever. So that's not, the numbers are weird, but I don't have a problem with the overtones of that statement.
Yeah, and one of the takeaways for me, just kind of like putting my security assessor, consultant, or CISSP type hat on, is when we work with clients and they talk about vendor management and supply chain, all that stuff. It's like, how do we validate, or how do we evaluate the risk that this particular vendor poses to us? Well, ask them how their development process works. Are they testing? Where in the process are they testing? Are they pen testing their products before every release? Ask, do some research and find out the good questions to ask your software vendors. And start asking some of these questions and putting some pressure on them to have some answers for it. That can kind of help you get some answers when it comes to, assessing the risk that vendors place on your organization. So
agreed.
Something that I think of, that people watching this would be like, okay, if I'm an IT manager or a security manager, how does this translate into kind of the products that I already have? Like some of the products that are common for law firms that we come that we see, NetDocs, iManage, we were talking about this earlier, ask them, do a review, ask them the questions of how they evaluate the security of their product. Do they pen test it? How often? How do they prioritize vulnerabilities? Do they notify you if there's a critical vulnerability in their software? Putting pressure on them can help start to move the needle forward a little bit. If their clients are putting pressure on them to have answers, you better believe that they'll start paying attention to that.
Completely agree with everything you just said. That's always a big lift for folks, is the vendor management, space and how to determine those things. So 100% agree with that. And, you have listed some of the top challenges that kind of came out of this report, like prioritizing vulnerabilities and where you test. Those are the reasons, just a quick shameless plug, those are the reasons that we got into the DevSecOps industry, right? At Security 360, is because those challenges were so insurmountable by the development group in these organizations that we were like, look, man, this is a security role. We can help you build this thing out if you don't have a security department capable of doing it. And that's really just kind of how it all got started. Yeah. And those are tough things to solve, especially if you're not seasoned in the DevSecOps world, right? And unfortunately, it is tough to find those people. They're unicorns.
Yep.
So anyway, super interesting stuff. I believe most of none of it, and it's still fun to talk about, though.
Yep, for sure.
Cool. Well, folks, that's all we have for you this week. Look for us again next week, same place, same time. And if you like this content, you can help us out a lot by like, share, subscribe, all that jazz on whatever platform you're consuming us on. And otherwise, I hope you have a great weekend.